everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. This is video 2 in my Western core series, Homer's Odyssey. Which Homer's Odyssey I read in the Lattimore translation, just like the Iliad, at least for this video. The first time I read it in the Robert Fagel's translation. And I also, like the Iliad, picked up a Fitzgerald translation in these extremely smelly, decorative volumes that I actually don't really care for, but it was super cheap. I argue, even though the Iliad, I prefer it over the Odyssey, I prefer it over most literature, as did Borges. But in any case, it is probably the Odyssey that is much more hooked into our cultural consciousness. So much so that Joyce in Ulysses, as the title of the work entails, of course, Odysseus is the Greek name for this hero, but Ulysses is the Latin name. And so Joyce modeled Ulysses on the Odyssey, and in fact, each of the 18 episodes in Ulysses is modeled on episodes. Are modeled on episodes from Homer's epic. Anyway, we'll get more into that once we get to our video on Joyce. Immediately, and I'm not going to go into the Greek of the first line as I did in the Iliad and go on a tangent about Homeric lexicons and so on. But right off the bat in the first line, we see a major difference between the two books. It says, "Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways." And so if we remember in the Iliad, it starts off, asking the Muse to sing of the wrath of Achilles. But now it's saying, "Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways." And many ways here, from the Greek, basically means resourcefulness. And you definitely get the sense that Ulysses or Odysseus is sort of an ancient Greek MacGyver, constantly figuring out clever ways to get out of his dilemmas. But anyhow, the main contrast, as I see it, is that in the Iliad we're looking at an attribute of a man, namely wrath of Achilles. However, in this book, we're focusing on the man himself, the hero Odysseus. But this book goes beyond just switching from an attribute to a personage. Of course, Clifton Fadiman, in his reading plan, which I'm always turning to extract a little nugget about these books, he says the search for his son Telemachus, or Telemachus, for his father, is a theme repeated in hundreds of novels since. So again, this is another reason that I've chosen this book as one of the core of the foundation of literature. Fadiman also points out that the Odyssey is not tragic like the Iliad. It stresses not our limitations, but our possibilities. I like using these Harold Bloom modern critical interpretations. I find that in his introduction, Bloom states that the Iliad is in fierce agon with the Bible, and it has set our standards of the sublime. But the Odyssey is a much more focused work, particularly in modern literature. And for Bloom, why this is because stories exist to defer death. And Odysseus is a grand evader of mortality, as he calls him. So Bloom, of course, is obsessed with Freud's conception of the reality principle. The Odyssey is definitely emblematic of the reality principle. Dickens' book, Realms of Gold, he says that Odysseus is, and along with some of the characters of the Bible, the dominant character of Western literature, and I would have to agree. As we saw in the Iliad, I pointed out that there's this description of graphic brutality with ocular gore, as I call it. And we see this again in the Odyssey. So we can compare these lines from the Odyssey, book 9. So seizing the fire point hardened timber, we twirled it in his eye, and the blood boiled around the hot point, so that the blast and scorch of the burning ball singed all his eyebrows and eyelids, and the fire made the roots of his eye crackle. And this is pure Homeric writing. The way that he can make you see and feel the things that are going on, and his words sing his imagination and awaken us. We also meet the character Telemachus, about whom it is told the muse loved him and reft him of his eyes, but gave him the sweet singing art. Now that's really interesting because, again, like I said in the Iliad video, Homer is famously blind, yet he's this extremely gifted poet. So could it be that here we have one of the first ever occurrences of the author inserting himself into the work, which we will see again and again when we get to, of course, Dante being the pilgrim of his own work, Chaucer being one of the pilgrims, and so on. The Odyssey gives us a lot of intellectual fodder. In fact, it's much more focused on the mind than with the body in terms of warfare from the Iliad. Zeus himself speaks in the first book of this epic, and he says, "Oh, for shame, how the mortals put the blame upon us, gods. For they say evils come from us, but it is they, rather, who by their own recklessness, with sorrow beyond what is given." Now that's interesting, coming from a culture that attributes so much to the gods, and seems so deterministic, to where you can see where Stoicism comes from, as seeing the gods as basically playing tricks on mortals and having mortals' fate in their own hands and so on. But here we have Zeus himself saying that, you know, the gods get blamed for a lot of things, but it's human recklessness that accounts for a lot of things. That's an interesting ambiguity that's thrown into what can easily be seen as a culture of determinism. And again, like I said, in the Odyssey, the mind is lauded over the body. Consider these lines: "How could I forget Odysseus the godlike, he who is beyond all other men in mind?" And again, Athena reveres Odysseus because, like she says, "Always you are the same, and such is the mind within you. And so I cannot abandon you when you are unhappy, because you are fluent and reason closely and keep your head always." So right there we get three attributes that show the ancient Greek conception of an outstanding person or an outstanding mind. One, you are fluent. Two, you reason closely. And three, you keep your head always. And these are attributes that we see culminate in, say, Cicero. The Odyssey also has the distinction, in my opinion, of being the first ever Bildungsroman. Athena prompts Telemachus to leave Ithaca because it is time to grow up. She says, "You should not go on clinging to your childhood." So this impetus to leave childhood behind prompts Telemachus to push off to sea, to find his father, to grow up. He's now dealing with not only the tensions of his search for a father, but also the stresses of his mother Penelope, and all of the suitors knocking at her door. And so it's an interesting counterpoise between the son and father. The son as going through his rite of passage into adulthood, and the father who, in a sense, is taking a rite of passage into old age. In general, the Odyssey is probably more well known to most of us who would sit down and read it. A lot of its stories and a lot of its figures will be familiar to us because, again, it has imbued the cultural consciousness. Even the Coen brothers' 2000 film, "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" is based on the Odyssey, and we can relate, of course, to this search. There's this searching going on that represents this existential bind that we all find ourselves in. The search for meaning, of course, as parallel to the search for a father, or from Odysseus's perspective, the search for home, namely Ithaca. Also get a sense of what the Greeks make of a true hero. And Odysseus / Ulysses will be praised in literature throughout the ages after this. Next, we'll see how he makes an appearance in Dante's Inferno. Of course, he's in one of the circles because he, after all, is a pagan and does not share in Dante's Christian religion. But he's still revered, and we could also turn to great poems such as Tennyson's Ulysses, which is interestingly modeled after Dante, who gives a final voyage to Odysseus that doesn't have any literary precedent. It's not in here at all, or it doesn't have any literary antecedent. It's not in Homer at all. So it's interesting how, as we move on from Homer to subsequent authors, we'll start to see how those subsequent authors are not only indebted to their predecessors, but they have this feeling that they need to usurp them or outdo them. That's video 2 of the Western Core series. Next up, in video 3, we will be looking at Dante's Inferno. Thank you for watching.